Hey everybody, I'm back! Welcome back. My name is Stephanie Bree. I know, and I'm so sorry I had to take a long-ass break, but my laptop broke, and I lost all my files, all my scripts, all my top 25 lists, all my production sheets, all my notes, everything I wanted to talk about, all my topics. I lost everything. I'm sorry. I had to recreate all of my documents. And so that's what I've been working on. But I'm back, and today I'm jumping in, and this is going to be a longer video, but it's kind of because, well, I want to give you something to chew on. So this is going to be a meaty video, I hope it's a good one. I hope it's a T-bone steak and not a Salisbury steak. And if you don't have teeth, sharpen your dentures. Let's get into it. Today's topic is the 90s retrospective. Now, I'm not even going to look back to see if I've already done previous 90s retrospectives, because I'm pretty sure I have. But this is where I'm going to take a deep dive into the 90s. I'm going to talk about everything. Politics, movies, television, pop culture, video games, computers, technology, whatever else I think of. But I'm not going to break it up into chunks. I'm just going to ramble a little bit. But I'll try to, pick a topic and then just sort of hey, let's talk about TV for a minute. But I might zigzag, Once I start talking about music, I might zigzag back to MTV for a minute, and that might lead me down the rabbit hole to some Nickelodeon. Who knows? Bear with me. I'm going to put a cap on this. I'm not going to let it go over an hour. So I hope it doesn't get that long. But I'm expecting 30 to 45 minutes on the short end, so buckle up. The reason why I wanted to do a 90s retrospective as a whole, broadly speaking, the decade as a whole, is because a lot of other YouTubers and people on social media are starting to reevaluate the 90s. And they're starting to ask the question, was the 90s actually better than we remember? Or are we blinded by nostalgia? Or option B, C, I lost count. Was it actually worse than we're letting on because we're blinded by nostalgia? Well, I'm not going to answer that question. That's not the topic. That's not the point. But that's what prompted this discussion. Instead, I'm just going to take I'm going to pull back and take I was there, hands-on, I lived it, reevaluation of what I remember of the 90s, and contrast that with what people think they remember of the 90s, or what younger folks who weren't there read about the 90s. So, I'm going to start with politics and get that out of the way. Politics were the same in the 90s as they are today. Divisive, messy, mudslinging, complicated assholes trying to tell us how to live our lives. So if you have a favorite politician from the 90s that you hold in high esteem, I'm here to tell you that they are just as crummy as the cockroaches we have today. But there were a few political scandals, political triumphs, and political battles that were fought in the 90s that I want to briefly gloss over. The first one is the HIV crisis. The 80s were a tumultuous time for queer folks like myself and people in my queer family. I was born in 82, so I lived during my formative years during the scary times of HIV. And, as a queer person who was, trying to figure out who I wanted to fall in love with and how far we were going to take it, HIV was in the back of my mind. And so the government didn't do shit in the 80s about it, so a lot of people died unnecessarily. And then some little white boy died, and all of a sudden the government took it seriously, and then we got a pretty good turnaround in the 90s with PSAs teaching people about safe sex and the rise of school districts implementing, for the first time in many cases, sex education programs. Some of it was morally, motivated, trying to teach girls to not have sex and teach boys how to have sex with girls without girls having sex with boys. But without having gay sex, it was a mess because Christo-fascism doesn't make a lick of sense, but they're going to keep trying to shove it down our throats. But that's needless to say, the government was making a half-assed attempt to fight HIV in the 90s with PSAs and, a greater awareness of sex education in the public school system. There was a lot of backlash, hence it becoming a political topic because politicians were getting into it. Now, the second political battleground of the 90s started in the 70s, 60s and 70s with the implementation of the Motion Picture Association of America film rating system that started with G, PG, and R and X, and then later they added PG-13 and replaced X with NC-17. And then in the 80s, we got the parental advisory. These were results of the, moral panic, the satanic panic, and things later. But in the 90s, the new battleground was violent video games. We all know the story. Joe Lieberman, Mortal Kombat, Night Trap, and then the ESRB gets created. We have the video game rating system implemented, and then the politicians were like, good, thank you, now go play your games and leave us alone because we don't understand technology because we're old farts. And then towards the end of the decade, you have two more major political upheavals in society. The first one is the Clinton scandal, which resulted in him getting impeached but not removed from office. There is a distinction. But that definitely cost the Democratic Party a lot of goodwill, which ultimately led to W getting elected in 2000 with the help of some Supreme Court shenanigans. But the other thing that happened in the 90s, towards the end of the decade, was the rise of school shootings. And this was a continuation of the satanic panic, a reaction to Columbine. And you started to get another course correction where, once again, violent music and movies and video games were in the spotlight. And there was a lot of political discussion by the talking heads and the radio voices about what to do about it. And then 9/11 happened and they decided they had bigger fish to fry, and then they moved on and then left us alone. But they're going to keep trying to come back. But those were the big political deals of the 90s, at least from the perspective of here in the U.S. Yeah, you had the Oklahoma City bombing, but that's not really political. That's politically motivated violence, but that's terrorism. And then you had, other, responses, social responses to violence, but again, that's not really political. And there were other political things, but those were the ones that I, as a child/teenager in the 90s, were aware of, because those were the ones that affected me directly. And so from the perspective of someone who was a kid in the 90s, that's what the talking heads were talking about that I was listening to. Everything else from, like, Kosovo to whatever the fuck OJ was doing, I don't care. I wasn't interested in, because it doesn't affect me any. So those were the big political things that, now that I've mentioned them and put them on the table, I'm just going to brush them aside and move on. Because there was really no resolution to any of those things, They just sort of gave up, when something else happened that caught their attention. So I've talked about television. I've done full videos on various television networks that either had their start in the 90s or rose to prominence in the 90s, and then lost their identity in later years. MTV, Nickelodeon, the Discovery Channel, Arts and Entertainment, the Biography Channel, Turner Classic Movies, etc. So you had a lot of forces at play in the 90s in regards to television. The first thing you had was a reversal of the Reagan-era removal of regulations on children's programming that the government took in a hard right turn on by implementing new, or a hard left turn, whichever way, whatever. I'm not trying to be political left and right, I'm just using traffic car analogies, but whatever. They took a hard turn into more regulations. And so they passed a law saying that television makers have to put ratings into the programming when you're watching TV shows, which means they have to implement V-chips in the lockout chips in their television sets so parents can use those ratings to block out programming they don't want their kids to have. But also, kids programming, or programming specifically marketed to kids, can no longer be directly marketing toys. So they did away with the cartoons can be toy commercials. You can still have a toy tie-in to the cartoon, but you have to have an educational slant to the cartoon now. It can't just be, to sell toys. Now, this is a rare case where the self-regulating practices that the television studios and toy companies implemented in the 80s, as in tacking on cheesy PSAs at the end of their cartoons to try to teach life lessons, didn't go far enough, and we actually did get government regulation for a change that actually said, hey, no, y'all dropped the ball, we're going to just take it away from you and tell you what to do now because you're not doing it. For better or for worse, it did mean that now kids programming can't have a tacked on PSA at the end. Now they have to have, the entire episode has to be informational and educational in some capacity. This is why you got really more mature but very politically motivated subject matter in cartoons like Exo Squad, the X-Men cartoon from the 90s, Batman the Animated Series, things like that. And then you had the rise of things like Barney the Dinosaur and stuff like that. I can't think of any others because I was, outgrowing that stuff by then, but you know what I'm trying to say. But it was also a reaction to the gritty 1990 TMNT live-action film and the rise of grunge and the taking of counterculture and making it mainstream in the early 90s. So television shows had to emulate that. They were either going to borrow from the extreme 90s aesthetic or from the more subdued but very serious grunge aesthetic. The grimier, quote, grungier, more grittier thing. In other words, more serious stuff. And then you got PSAs dressed up like cartoons in the form of Captain Planet and the Planeteers. But I digress. So in the kids front, that's where things were changing in the 90s. Now, this didn't happen overnight. It took a while for the regulation to pass and for, television companies and manufacturers and studios to implement and execute these changes. But, they were there. Now, on the teen front, obviously the biggest thing was MTV. But aside from MTV, everybody else was, for the first time in television history, trying to go after teenagers and preteens as a specific chunk of the market. Up to this point, it was like parents make the decisions and little kids nag their parents. We don't have any reason to bother with teenagers because they have jobs. They're more busy with that. Wait a minute, they have jobs. That means they have paychecks. Duh! Took them that long to figure it out. But once advertisers figured out that teenagers do have paychecks and preteens can nag their older brother and sister for money. Well, hey. So we saw a rise of marketing that was targeting television programming specifically tailored for the first time in history to the preteen market and to the teen market. So for preteens, you had Nickelodeon, and ultimately that led to Snick. And then you also had, for preteens and teenagers, you had TGIF on ABC Friday nights. I've already done a video on this. And then, of course, you had MTV, but you had other networks making attempts. Cartoons were becoming more mature. You had the anime invasion, as they sometimes refer to it as. You have, Power Rangers, which is still very kid-friendly, but also, even though it's kid-friendly, trying to tackle more mature topics. But then you got things like 90210, Party of Five, My So-Called Life, Saved by the Bell, Boy Meets World. You had TV shows that were either starring teenagers or supposed to be teenagers. Sometimes the actors weren't teenagers, but targeted teenagers. Sabrina the Teenage Witch, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Degrassi if you're Canadian. This was a new concept. Now, as someone who started out a preteen in the 90s and then into the 90s as a full-blown teenager, yeah, I was there to observe whoa, they're actually making TV shows, not just cartoons, but TV shows for me. Like, whoa, they don't do that. Now, you also saw the increase of movies for teenagers. Now, you had movies about teenagers in the 80s that Gen X and Boomer teenagers, or adults who were teenagers, Gen X and Boomers who had been teenagers at one time, who grew up, who were watching those movies. Gen X being the ones watching the John Hughes movies in the 80s. But those were different. Those were a lot more serious, and they were a lot more, grown up. You get into the 90s, you're starting to get stuff that, plays to teenagers' sensibilities and attitudes. For film, you got things like The Mighty Ducks, Can't Hardly Wait. Tail end of the decade, you'd get 10 Things I Hate About You and She's All That. Along the way, you'd get Josie and the Pussycats. Along the way, you would get things like Wayne's World, which really appealed to teenagers. Bill and Ted. You had a couple of those movies, one in 88, I believe, and one in 90, 91. So, it's in there. And then you have stuff like Encino Man. You actually had movies that were targeting the teenage demographic. Like people who were teenagers at that point in time, not just people who had vague memories of what it was like when they were teenagers. So it was a lot different. So that was a really innovative idea that is just commonplace today, but it was just a brand new concept in the 90s. The other thing you saw was MTV recognizing that, hey, yes, teenagers watch music videos, but they also like My So-Called Life and cartoons like Beavis and Butthead. So MTV steered into the skid and started producing more original programming that wasn't music related. You got stuff like the Real World, Road Rules, Daria, Singled Out, and then, other things I can't think of off the top of my head, but they were there. Grunge, I don't think grunge knew who its audience was. They thought they were counterculture, and they were going after the then late teens, early 20s Gen Xers. Because the millennials at the time, we were still in grade school going into middle school when grunge came on the scene. So us millennials, we were around when grunge came on the scene, while our older brothers and sisters who grunge appealed to were listening to Nirvana and Alice in Chains. We were still listening to Paula Abdul and the New Kids on the Block and Vanilla Ice, because that's the music that was targeting us. Also, Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, or Jazzy Jeff and the Fresh Prince, if you want to get technical, and then stuff like that. Once we, the millennials, became teenagers in the mid to late 90s, the music shifted towards us. And this is when you got the rise of ska, which was our response to grunge. For us, it was like, yeah, punk rock of the 70s and 80s, that's old fogey music, not interested. Grunge, that's like whiny bitch crybaby music. I'm still a kid. I'm a teenager, but I'm still a kid. I'm still trying to have fun and live life. I'm not ready for that whiny crybaby shit yet. I haven't grown up enough to understand it. So I want, Smash Mouth and No Doubt and Beck and, the B-52s and these, like fringy, fun, but also, not always fun punk rock ska bands that are like, fun punk. Punk rock for kids. Punk light, if you will. Diet punk, there you go. Where we can still pretend we're being rebellious because we're teenagers, but also we're still trying to just have fun, We're not ready for the real world yet. Some of us grew up faster than others, unfortunately. Some people in the 90s, as in any decade, had shittier childhoods than others, so they may have gravitated to the more serious music. Now, where hip-hop music started out in the 90s, it was coming off of the 80s, where it was just going mainstream. It was still reminiscent of the, dance music that it originated from, happier, go luckier, but still with a message. But we also saw the rise of gangster rap and the proliferation of G-Funk in particular. And so a lot of us steered into that as well. So the G-Funk was really heavy for preteens and teenagers to be consuming, but the music was like dance pop-ish. So it was like, okay, this is still kind of fun to listen to, but also I'm going to listen to the PG-13 version, because as soon as I get my hands on the R-rated version, I'm like, whoa, I didn't know that's what you were talking about. Holy shit. Songs took on a whole new meaning. But hey, we still had the, the scrubbed versions of those songs to listen to on the radio and MTV, so we weren't really, we were aware tangentially of what the gangster rap was talking about, but we didn't know how dark it really was. There's a big difference between the line, I just drank a fifth of Kool-Aid, dare me to drive, and I just drank a fifth of vodka, dare me to drive. And when you're a teenager, that line hits a little bit differently when you realize he's actually making a drunk driving reference. Holy shit! I'm not ready for that, but I'll still dance to it. So yeah, of course I know that came out in 99, 2000 or somewhere in there, so we're talking the tail end of the 90s, but hear me out. So, and then at the very tail end of the 90s, you had pop throughout the 90s, but pop even took on a new, aesthetic. You had the more serious grown-up pop, like U2 and, Mariah Carey. You still had some lighter, poppier, fun stuff like TLC, but even pop music, like Ace of Base, Real McCoy, CNC Music Factory, stuff like that. It was, in some ways more serious than we were used to, or a lot more grown up than we were used to. Gina G, ooh, ah, just a little bit. That song's a little bit more suggestive than a 12-year-old might recognize the first time he or she listens to it. But then at the tail end of the 90s, we go full hog with the boy-girl bands. We got mid to late 90s, you get the Spice Girls, which are full-on pop. A couple years later, you're getting the rise of NSYNC, the Backstreet Boys, Christina Aguilera, and Britney Spears. And then even the Beastie Boys, who were very punk rock and grunge throughout the 80s and early 90s, flipped and went full pop by the end of the 90s with Hello Nasty. There's some serious songs in there, but you're talking a lot of, 3 MCs in 1 DJ and Intergalactic and stuff like that. Hey, this is just for fun, music is just fun for us. So yeah, if you're a Gen Xer and you started out the 90s as going into your late teens, early 20s, you probably more gravitate to the more mature, grown-up stuff that was available in the 90s. The rest of us youngerns, us millennials, we were still listening to the fun stuff. The poppy stuff, Cotton Eye Joe, Macarena, the shampoo Trouble from the Power Rangers movie. We were still trying to have fun. We were still kids. We hadn't fully grown up yet. A lot of us became, we reached our adulthood, late teens, early adulthood, early 20s, at the turn of the millennium. That's why they call us millennials. That's where the name comes from. Our defining generational moment was 9/11. Most of us millennials just graduated high school, or were about to graduate high school, or were already entering the workforce or going off to college when 9/11 happened. So that happened for us at a time where we were ready to enter the adult world and take it on and be like, let's go, full of optimism. And then 9/11 happened and we were like, whoa, we weren't ready for this. I'm going to backtrack to the 80s where I felt safe. I've done a whole video on this. And then we became obsessed, to an unhealthy degree, I would argue, with the 80s, which we remain obsessed with today. Even though we were toddlers in the 80s, that's when we felt safe. We felt safe in the 80s because there was no terrorism. Terrorists to us were guys wearing hockey masks yelling Cobra at the top of their lungs. They weren't scary. Those were cartoons. We had no concept of terrorism. We had no concept of school shootings. By the way, yeah, I was in high school when Columbine happened, so that was a traumatic, defining event for our generation as well. I just think it was overshadowed by 9/11, to be fair. But that was 2001, so that's after the 90s. Now, Columbine was, 98, 99, so anyways. But MTV was already on the decline mid-90s. And in response to that, they launched MTV2, which I've already done a whole video on. Because they were like, hey, we got to do like 16 and pregnant and all this other shit because we want to get teenagers watching our stuff. But we know there's still some of you younger teenagers, 13, 14-year-olds that just want to listen to music videos. So we'll throw you a bone. But for the most part, there was a whole lot of, a lot of growing up to do in the 90s for us. In some ways, before we were ready. My parents refused to explain to me, what Bill Clinton was accused of, as were my high school teachers. It was just like, it would be vague things like inappropriate relations with a coworker or a subordinate or things like that. And it's like, I don't know what any of those words mean. Can you try again, please? And then Eminem was like, oh yeah, our president got his dick sucked. And I was like, wait, that's what she did? Ew, who would do that? Also, anyways, like I said, I'm a queer woman. Now, we also had the insanely lightning fast proliferation of technology in the 90s. Yes, the home computer was sort of invented in a roundabout way and introduced to the market in the 70s, but it was not mainstream. The microcomputer, the Apple II, the Atari 8-bit, the Commodore PET VIC-20, Commodore 64. Those things were just becoming a thing in the 80s. The introduction of the PC in 81. Computers did exist and were advancing at a fairly steady pace in the 80s, but they were still pretty useless for the vast majority of people. They could play video games if you were a gamer, but so could my Nintendo, and it could do it better. So what else you got? Spreadsheet software? I'm a kid. I don't need that. You know, my parents don't own a business. They don't need that. So, alright, you know, if you were rich enough and could afford the long distance fees, you could connect to a BBS on the internet, but there were no websites. The World Wide Web hadn't been invented yet. So again, why would I do that? I'm 8 years old. Come on. I don't need to go on to a BBS and argue with people about math problems and, you know, who's the smartest Ninja Turtle because Power Rangers doesn't exist yet. So the computers, while I wanted a computer in the 80s, it was really hard to justify to my parents why they should buy me one. And when you take into consideration, very few of my friends growing up all had computers, I would say the vast majority of my friends were also equally unsuccessful at convincing their parents to get them a computer. And with good reason. You know, when the best you can do is Windows 3.1 and maybe play Doom, I can play Doom at the computer lab after school for free. So, but technology was changing rapidly in the 90s. In the 80s, cell phones did exist, but they were for rich people and stockbrokers. In the 90s, you were starting to see middle-class people and business people with cell phones. You know, regular people. Made more money than my family did, but still regular people. By the end of the 90s, cell phones were starting to become accessible pretty much to everybody. Not quite, but they were getting closer. Computers at the beginning of the 90s, just like throughout the 80s, really weren't that useful. You know, yeah, you could play video games, but again, they weren't as good at it as home consoles because of the hodgepodge of standards and specifications and, you know, all this other hardware crap you had to have. And so there was no, like, uniform platform for computer games. Yes, there was Windows and DOS, but there was also Atari was still limping on with their Falcon computers. Commodore was still limping on with their Amigas. You know, Apple was still pretending to be relevant with their Macintosh. And there were a few others floating around out there limping along. But for the most part, computers hadn't really gone mainstream yet. Yeah, they were finally in schools. A lot of schools in the early 90s, when I was in grade school, would have a computer in the library and a computer in the office that the secretary would use, and maybe one or two additional computers somewhere in the building. That was it. But by 95, something happened. Windows became the de facto standard. Not just because they finally perfected the UI and made Windows actually functional and useful to everyday people, you know, but they also introduced, you know, the web to most people by having the web browser, Internet Explorer, as an option, and a lot of web features built in, and internet connectivity built in, and easy, you know, just like click a thing and then now you're on the internet. It became so much easier to get on the internet. You didn't have to dick around with AOL anymore. Yeah, there were still a lot of people that had AOL and CompuServe, but it wasn't necessary anymore. I could just call my local phone company, and for $10 a month, they would give me 56K internet, and all I had to do was click this little thing, enter a password, and I'm online. Assuming my sisters don't want to use the phone, because like I said, cell phones weren't quite mainstream yet, but they were getting there. Now, you saw other advancements in technology. Cars, you started to see the rise of the beginnings of what would become GPS and the beginnings of, new safety features, and them making attempts to introduce electric vehicles and solar-powered vehicles. They weren't successful, but they were making the attempt. We had a half-assed attempt at introducing virtual reality in the 90s, which we basically abandoned the headsets by 94 and went full-on VR 3D with the introduction of the Sega Saturn and the Sony PlayStation, which took the VR concept mainstream. PlayStation dominated the second half of the 90s, not unlike today. But it was different back then because it was unexpected, and we had a lot more options in the 90s. You had 3DO and Neo Geo and Sega, and another Sega, and a couple of different Nintendos, and the Virtual Boy, and the CDI, and the Game Gear, and the Jaguar, blah, 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 blah. We had a lot more choices, but most of that stuff was too expensive or didn't have any games worth a shit to really matter. The big players in the early 90s were Sega with their Genesis and later upgrades, Sega CD and 32X, and Nintendo with their Super NES and their handheld Game Boy. Sega had the Game Gear. And then in the mid-90s, we got the introduction of 3D gaming properly, mainstream, with Saturn and PlayStation, and then later Nintendo 64. And at the very tail end of the 90s, we got the Dreamcast. So we saw a rapid advancement of technology. In 1990, we were playing 8-bit Nintendo games that looked just barely better than Commodore 64. By the end of the 90s, we were playing fully VR without the headset 3D environments on the Dreamcast and the N64 and the PlayStation. We had Final Fantasy 7, 8, and 9. We had all of the Tony Hawk's games, Metal Gear Solid, the 3D, Super Mario 64. The 3D era was here. Big leap from the 8-bit to the, 64-bit, 32-bit 3D era. Yeah, we had the stopgap 16-bit era, which was still cartoony and pixelated like the 8-bit NES, but, making attempts, more colorful and more detailed, but making attempts to make more advanced graphics and sound with Mode 7 and Super FX chips and SVP chips and 32X, etc., etc. But we saw technology moving so lightning fast. Computers went from these overpriced boxes that, there maybe there were 3 or 4 in our entire school, to by the mid-90s we had Windows 95. There were whole computer labs in our school, and they were making us take a dedicated computer class to learn how to use these things because they were necessary. And by the end of the decade, I finally got one of these boxes. I got a compact Rosario with a Pentium 3, and I was like, yes! Finally! I got a computer I can do something with. I can watch DVDs on it, because it came with a DVD-ROM. And also play some pretty cool video games, because there's finally, with DirectX, the introduction of Windows 95, we finally have a standard. Now, computer games can actually... You just go to the store and buy a PC game and just know it'll work with your system. There might be a specific video card for a specific game here or there, but for the most part, most games you just knew were going to work. Whereas in the 80s, you didn't know if this game runs on Atari ST or 800XL or Commodore 64, Commodore 128, or whatever. You didn't know what if it worked with your system or not, and you had to read the back of the box and pray to God that if it didn't list your system, that maybe the version of your systems, was compatible. Like you had a Commodore 128 and it said compatible with the 64, you had to hope that it would run in Commodore 64 mode. Might not. But now it was, this game runs on Windows 98 with DirectX 3.0. Hey, my computer and my graphics card are compatible with those, so I'm good to go. It was a lot easier, a lot more simplified. You also had the early days of the World Wide Web. You had the early websites that were useless. static web pages with, rotating GIFs in the corner. Maybe a few hyperlinks and then obnoxious web rings. But, like, by 98, 99, that was when we hit peak World Wide Web. Like, now you have useful, functional websites like IMDb, Yahoo, Google, Amazon, eBay, all these other websites that you can actually go to and do stuff. Interesting, fun, compelling, not just Microsoft Encarta on the web. You could do stuff now. And there were other websites that were getting in on it. MTV.com, Nickelodeon.com, Nintendo.com. We don't talk about what Sega was doing in the 90s. It's best that we don't. But yeah, the internet became a real legit thing by 98. But from 90 to 98, that's 8 years of the decade, there was no concept of the internet. It was just this thing we sometimes saw in science fiction movies and TV shows like Ghost Rider or The Net or Hackers, It was like, yeah, we know about the internet, but we also don't know what it is or how to use it because it's not useful yet. But by the end of the 90s, we couldn't live without it. It was like just such a part of our everyday lives, that it was just like, nah, we're connected and we're just going to stay connected and this is our life now. CDs existed in the 90s. Cassette tapes were still, floundering. Vinyl records were refusing to die, despite the fact that, goddamn it, they should have. But we also saw the introduction of a new technology in the 90s. The MP3, which would really take off in the early 2000s, but it was getting, towards the tail end of the 90s, you were starting to wonder what is an MP3. It was things people were talking about. Napster would come on the scene and make it, mainstream in the news cycle. People were like, we have to talk about MP3s now. You had newscasters that were trying to tell you what is an MP3 and how do you use it. And what do you do with it? Well, you steal it from the Napster, you put it on this little plastic thing with a couple of buttons, you plug in your headphones and you listen to music. Yeah, it doesn't hold as many songs as a CD, but it's digital. We didn't understand that CDs were digital. Also, because we didn't really have a concept of what digital was. We didn't know what that meant yet. It's not in our vocabulary, when you're 12. But, because, digital to me, at 12 years old, means digital clock. Oh, it's just digital, it's digits on a clock. It's not, the arms on a clock ticking around a circle. It's, numbers I can read. Because, yeah. Public education in the U.S. sucks. Never learned how to read a clock. I'm sure they tried to teach me in 1st or 2nd grade, but I didn't pay attention. I was like, I've got a digital watch. Why do I need this? Yeah, my digital watch was a Ninja Turtle. You flipped open his shell to get to the inside that told you what time it was. But hey, I was a kid. Sue me. But there were other things in the 90s. Like, I talked about the introduction of movies that were targeting teenagers for the first time, right? And movies and music, technology, we dabbled a little bit. I've done whole series on the bit wars, the console wars of the 80s and 90s. So yeah, obviously I just sort of briefly touched upon that. There were so many things going on in the 90s that overall, I'm going to make a bold statement. The 90s was no different than any other decade. They're all the same. Shit happens, good things happen, bad things happen, technology advances, politics regress, people bitch and moan about the fall of America or the degradation of the fabric of society or whatever. They've been having those arguments since the beginning of time, and they'll keep having those arguments until the end of time. Because at the end of the day, it really boils down to two things. The generation prior to you is always going to think they were better than you, and the generation below you is always going to think they were better than you. So, and your generation is always going to think that they're the best generation. So yeah, when you're a kid in the 90s, you're going to grow up and say, yeah, I had the best time in the 90s. The 90s were the best decade. But if you were a kid in the 50s, to you, the 50s were the best decade. If you were a kid in 2006, the 2000s were the best decade. And so on and so forth. It's human nature, you know. God damn it. So, I would argue that I think toys were better in the 80s. I think that cartoons were better in the 80s. Movies, especially horror movies, were better in the 80s. Sci-fi movies, that's a topic for another day, but good God, we barely got any good sci-fi movies in the 90s. Yeah, they were still out there. We got, Independence Day, Men in Black, The Fifth Element, but not a lot. 90s weren't a good decade for science fiction, not really. Better on TV than in cinemas, but, that's another topic. But overall, I'm still gonna say I had some good times in the 90s, I had my Sega Genesis, and later I got a PlayStation and an N64. I had some good times with my CD player and my CD Walkman and my cassette Walkman. I had some good times watching MTV and Nickelodeon. But I also had some bad times back in the 90s too, getting bullied in school and learning what the word fellatio means. I was probably too young to learn what that was, but thank you, Bill Clinton, for ruining the tail end of my childhood. But yeah, I think the 90s were an okay decade. I don't think overall they were worse or better than the 80s. We still had some good times in the 90s. Mountain Dew was getting bigger and more popular than ever, so it was easier to find it. In the early 80s, Mountain Dew wasn't that or the early 90s, it wasn't that popular of a drink yet. So you could find a vending machine that didn't sell Mountain Dew, so I'd have to settle for like Dr. Pepper, But in the late 90s, Mountain Dew was in every vending machine, even if it was a Coke machine, because they had no alternative. They tried with the Surge. They tried with, bringing Mellow Yellow back once or twice. But no, nothing beats Mountain Dew. Yum, yum, yum. Doritos and other potato chips became more extreme in the 90s. You had the 3Ds and the Pops and the Cheetos had the 3D paws, Cheetos paws or whatever. Hot Pockets became massively popular in the 90s. There were some good times in the 90s. But not any better times than anyone in the 2000s had, or anyone in the 2010s had, or kids growing up today had. Just different experiences. Not necessarily worse, not necessarily better. Yeah, you could say kids in the 60s were missing out by not having the internet and PlayStation, but they didn't know they were missing out because those things didn't exist and they had no concept of it. So they had good times with what they had available to them. Yeah, we had dial-up internet in the 90s, and that sucked. But kids today have lightning-fast fiber optic internet that speeds are so fast we don't even really know how to measure them. But we didn't care. We didn't have a concept of high-speed internet in the 90s. We barely had a concept of what the internet was in the 90s. And I don't feel any lesser than kids today for it because I had alternatives. I didn't need the internet. I had magazines. I had comic books. I had books. I didn't need Amazon in the 90s. I had a local comic book store. I had a local video game store. I had a local video rental store. We didn't need Netflix yet. We still had cable. Which was pretty good in the 90s, by the way. Yeah, you had commercials and time slots and everything else, but we didn't care because that's just the way it was. It worked for us. And you had the TV Guide. You had the TV Guide channel. So it wasn't like you couldn't plan your day around the TV shows you wanted to watch. You just knew at this time slot you're watching this channel at this time slot, you're watching that channel. Or you pop a blank tape into the VCR and record the channel that you can't watch while you watch the one you can. We did alright. We did okay in the 90s, you know? It wasn't the dark ages. Not like the 60s. Stay cool.